Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this presentation on hypercasual in China. Just as a quick introduction to begin with, my name is Allison, and I've had 8 years in the mobile games industry where I've built product and analytics teams at PopCap, Game Analytics, and Movie Star Planet. I joined JoyPac after that, where I oversee operations. And just so you can get to know me a little more, my favorite game is Animal Crossing. So shout out to my Animal Crossing friends out there. Today I want to talk about the rise of hypercasual. Well, hypercasual has been talked about a lot, so I'm going to narrow in on how hypercasual and this trend is shaping up in China in particular. And then I'll wrap up with what we've learned launching over 20 games in that market so far over the last year. So hypercasual is a new word in the gaming industry's vernacular, and it's come to denote games that are really easy to pick up, have simple core loops for gameplay, short session lengths that make them very shareable, and they have broad appeal. I want to emphasize that these types of games have always been around, from Flappy Bird's huge success in 2013 to Crossy Road the following year, and so on, like you can see here. Hypercasual, more so than the simplicity of gameplay, really denotes a business model and a way of doing business for studios and publishers. Hypercasual is a playground for developers and publishers that thrive with development speed. This is just to show that the hypercasual space moves very quickly. You can see here that Voodoo and Ketchup have launched almost 50 games in the App Store last year. And so it is about scale, and again, it's about a way of doing business for these key players. So hypercasual is here not just because some studios ramped up their speed. Hypercasual is here because the players are here as well. There's a big market demand for snack-sized content and short gameplay sessions. First and foremost, this is because it complements other gameplay. Like you can see here, 70% of hypercasual players also play in-app purchase games. So they're playing these simple games, and they're also playing games with more depth to them. Now, this leaves 22% of hypercasual players only playing hypercasual games, and they're doing so for a very particular reason. That's because they have very limited time for games in general. Hypercasual games engage users who don't have time to play these other in-depth games, and this really is expanding the pie of players as a whole. So this EDAR report is some evidence of that limited time. It's talking about how 75% of mobile gamers play while they're waiting or doing something else. So short gameplay sessions in hypercasual are very appealing, and there's a lot of market demand for them. So I want to transition now and talk about the hypercasual trend, and particularly in China. First, I'll lay the groundwork by talking about how it's come about in the West, and then we'll go east. There's a great series on Pocket Gamer about the rise of hypercasual games from AppLovin, and I definitely recommend that you read this article if you want the full history. Prior to hypercasual becoming a word in the West, we had a market that looked a little bit like this. First, we had casual games that were born out of Facebook with heavy social mechanics and smart in-app purchase triggers. From there, we went more in-depth with mid-core games. They had in-depth gameplay concepts that had mastered virtual economies, and this is where we started seeing more and more competition for those whale in-app purchase players. That evolved into core, where there's even more competition for those whale players, almost to the point where all gameplay really is catered to them. These core games also have some heavier themes in them. And it was out of this environment where hypercasual came about. It's a bit of a backlash to all of the in-app purchase competition, and it really was a nostalgic revival. And these are quotes from those Pocket Gamer articles that I mentioned, and I just love both of these terms because it's very true. It's back to the basics of gameplay, taking advantage of a new monetization model. Now in China, the story is a little bit different. Chinese players are moving to hypercasual, but from a different starting point. Traditionally, core genres have ruled the top charts in China from the start. In Asia, it's all about MMO, RPGs, MOBAs, strategy, and card battlers. And this is a result of predominantly PC play before the app stores came about, as opposed to Facebook. Consoles were banned in China, so gamers flocked to PC where these free-to-play monetization mechanics had really flourished. So the trend of hypercasual in China has been slower to catch on, really because of this history. That said, lately more hypercasual games are becoming chart toppers on iOS in China. These are examples of games I pulled from the top downloaded charts, I think it was 2 weeks ago. So these were 4 out of 10 of the top downloaded games in China were hypercasual. But if you looked at the same time at the top 10 downloaded games in the West, all 10 of them were hyper-casual. So this is just to show that it's been a little slower to move over to China, but it is definitely evolving. Chinese players are very inherently competitive and socially minded. Again, maybe because of their history with PC play. So IO games, level-based runners have been popular. We've also seen physics-based puzzles and arcade games rise to the charts over there. Another reason why hypercasual has been a bit delayed in China is because of the advertising ecosystem. Now, hypercasual, the business model is all about being able to buy players at a very low cost, that's your CPI, and monetize them at scale with ads, that's your lifetime value or LTV. So the advertising ecosystem is particularly important for supporting hypercasual. At this point, China really has caught up in terms of eCPM and CPI levels. eCPM and CPI in China really mirrors that of what we see in the West, particularly on iOS. And I do want to say, though, that the advertising ecosystem in China is different than what's in the West. There are different ad networks and players that you need to be paying attention to. So while running UA campaigns requires the same activities, like generating creatives and testing them on the different networks, you can't necessarily apply the same methodology from West to East. There are other key challenges to entering China, and very probably top of mind for most people are the government regulation and licensing issues in this market. Now, I call these issues table stakes because this has been happening for a long time in China, but last year was a special year where the government stopped issuing licenses for a 9-month period of time. They opened back up in December, only to close again because they had a huge backlog of games. Now, at this point, we've seen a slow trickle of games getting licenses. I think it's up to over 1,000 games have been approved so far this year, but typically 6,000 games or more a year get approvals. So there's still a long way to go and a big backlog. This isn't necessarily a problem for hyper-casual games that are driven by advertising on iOS. The regulation here is around in-app purchases, so hyper-casual games are a little safer from scrutiny. Now, that said, regulations are still being defined, and this is something we watch very closely. Another challenge in China is the Android App Store fragmentation. So because Google Play isn't allowed in China, isn't available, Android stores have proliferated across large tech companies, internet service providers, and cell phone manufacturers. It's important to be on all of them. Like you can see here, you need to be on at least 15 stores to have 90% coverage of the market. But you also need to be on all of the Android stores because of IP protection, so that your IP isn't taken from one store and put on an alternative store. Now, I don't want to scare you off too much by talking about the challenges of launching games in China, because the market opportunity in China is huge. China has 800 million mobile phone users across iOS and Android, and 242 million of those are iOS alone. Now, the US has around 250 million mobile phones in total, so the iOS market matches the total US market, comparing China to the US. So this is just to say that there's a lot of scale there. Now, mobile phones are also much more integrated into people's lives in China. The rise of the mobile phone usage over in China was aligned with the rise of their economy. So they really have a mobile-first culture. They do things like paying their utility bills on their phone. They order taxis, they order food, all within some of these super apps like WeChat. And this is just to say that everyone has a phone and uses it deeply because their society requires it. They spend a lot of time on their phone, and they actually spend more time as a percentage of that time playing games as well. So China is a very interesting market, not just because it's big, but also because the attention is there for mobile players in China. Now, Joypack was founded a little bit over a year ago because we saw these problems in the market and these opportunities for Western developers. Our solution is to blend, we like to talk about blending the best from the West and the East. And this includes open, transparent business practices. We try to have a lot of communication and trust. When you're working with us, you work with our people in our Copenhagen office. This is also where the contracts are signed and the legal jurisdiction resides. We also have a very Eastern, get-it-done style of teamwork. We have an almost 25-person team in Beijing handling our game launches and our live ops, as well as giving us that necessary access to the relationships needed in China to get work done. Now that's enough of a sales pitch. I want to get into the games we've launched. We've had great traction so far, launching over 20 games at this point. And I'm loving this, of course, because I'm a data person. So between the games we've tested and these games that we've launched, we really have a lot of data and insights here. So let's get into what we've learned. First thing I want to talk about in terms of insights is that more than blocks and balls are needed for hyper-casual games in China. Characters in particular really help with the marketability of the game. So an example of this is Fluffy Fall, which is a game we published for What Games out of Paris. This game was launching around the Lunar New Year, so we took 3 of the Fluffies and adapted them to Chinese zodiac characters. We featured this in our UA campaigns, and it really helped intrigue players and get them to click through on those ads. And once they were in the game, it also helped engage them with the game and retain them in the game as well. So this might be because the dominance of more in-depth games in China, but gameplay for hyper-casual can be snackable and needs to be snackable, but it also needs to be personally relatable as well. So tied to that, another thing we've seen work really well in China are games that have self-deprecating humor and kind of awkward scenarios. This is our game called Skip School. There's a sense of nostalgia and fantasy around skipping school that really hits home with the players, and it's something that they want to talk about and share and create content around. This type of scenario has led to very high organic rates. For this game, we've had 7 organic installs for every paid install throughout the lifetime of this game. And virality is something that we can't necessarily influence, and same with the humor. But there are things that, as a game developer, you can do to support organic installs through social sharing. And that very in particularly is working with TikTok and WeChat. So these are the 2 most important social channels in China to build into your game for sharing. So now I want to talk about retention. It is my core belief that day 1 retention is overused in the industry. Day 1 is a marker of how good the core gameplay loop is in your game. So if that isn't working, you need to go back to your core gameplay and figure out the fun. But that day 1 retention doesn't necessarily tell you if your game is going to be profitable. What is going to tell you if you're going to make money is day 7 retention and beyond. Just as an example, the lift you see is in lifetime value when you increase day 7 retention by 1%. So like from 10% to 11% is 10 times more than if you increase day 1 retention by the same amount. So like from 40 to 41%, for example. So for these hyper-casual games where margins are very small, this lift is extremely important. My advice to you is to get day 1 retention to some benchmark, and the industry talks about 40% as a minimum. Then focus all of your efforts on optimizing day 7 retention. So short bursts of gameplay are what attract players to hyper-casual games like we've talked about. In China, while still very short, Chinese players have comparatively longer session lengths. So we're talking 3 to 5 minutes instead of 1 to 3 minutes. And this has design implications in terms of gameplay and engagement and ad monetization placements, for example. It's just something you need to be aware of, that these players have relatively longer session lengths, and you need to keep it fun and snackable within that time. A focus on increasing session length can be very impactful as well to increasing that lifetime value. And for these games, again, with a very small margin, doing whatever you can to increase lifetime value is very important. So keep an eye on your session lengths. We talked about this a little bit with Fluffy as an example, but hyper-casual games typically don't need a lot of localization and culturalization because they're so simple. In bringing them to the market, they don't need to necessarily be changed significantly. That said, the changes that do need to happen are there. It's minimal, there's a little bit, but it needs to be proper localization and culturalization. So this means translating your text to simplified Chinese, but not using Google Translate to do it. You really need a native speaker to get the nuance of your game, even though these games are so simple, into the text of your game. It also means potentially modifying some of the content. Characters, like we talked about with Fluffy, and color schemes are important as well. The last point I want to talk about is about showing ads in your game. Chinese players have a very high threshold for seeing and interacting with advertising. So, as we increase the number of ad views in these games in China, we don't see as big of an impact on retention as you might see in the West. There are very elegant ways to integrate ads, of course. Rewarded videos, in particular, are much more appealing to all players, West and East. Those formats in particular can really engage players in your game and make them almost appreciate seeing the advertising that they see because they get a great reward in your game. But Chinese players are very willing to have ads splashed at them of any type, so banners, interstitials, etc. My advice to you is to build it in from the start and really not to be shy about it. So that's everything I wanted to say about hypercasual in China. For the most part, it's the same phenomenon that we've seen happening in the West, but it's been a bit delayed in China, and it's been nuanced because of the history of gaming and the app stores over there. Again, it's a huge opportunity for Western developers, and I would love to talk with you about the games and your plans for China. So I hope this inspired you to consider China for your hypercasual games and gave you some concrete steps on how to find success there. I would be very happy to talk with you more about this. Either please send me an email, ping me on WeChat, find me on LinkedIn. I would love to talk about your games, talk about this market, and take any questions that you might have from this presentation. Thanks again for your time. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day.